Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. Keeping in touch with exes can be a challenge, but Karen Kusama redefines it in her dinner party horror film, The Invitation, which is currently streaming on Netflix. And to discuss today's film, I'm joined once again by a friend of the show, Bernie. What's going on, brother?
I appreciate you having me back, man. How are things going?
Not too bad. I'm excited to talk about what on a rewatch is still the most uncomfortable movie I think I've ever watched.
I'm right there with you on that. This is I saw this once before, and even rewatching it again today, I was like, there's just so many uneasy feelings that director makes you feel with the way that she shoots this. I mean, I think it's a phenomenal film for us to kind of talk about here.
Yeah, it's definitely a teeth-grinding movie, and I'm never not kind of just a raw nerves at the end of it. But let's get a quick summary of it out of the way for those who haven't seen The Invitation. The Invitation follows Will and his girlfriend Kira, who accept an invitation to a dinner party hosted by Will's ex-wife Eden, who's just returned from a mysterious trip abroad. It doesn't take long for old wounds to open up and for new sinister tensions to arise. Kind of like it in the intro, I think the only question I can ask you right off the bat, is this the most uncomfortable you've ever been watching a movie?
It's definitely the most confused I've been watching a movie. There are so many points of moments, at least, where they're having a discussion and you just have no idea what the hell is going on. You know, again, I hats off to that director. What did you say her name was?
Karen Kusama.
Karen Kusama. Yeah, I mean, she did a phenomenal job on this, but I mean, the acting and the performances that you get from these guys, these are like, I feel like B-movie actors for the most part, but they give a hell of a performance, and that kind of adds to that uneasiness and tension throughout the film.
Yeah, I'd say that I would say not B-movie, but more just like lesser known. Like, this is one of those movies that came out in 2015, I believe, that really kind of allowed these people to highlight their range and their ability, because this is a movie that the premise is very simplistic. It's people attending a dinner party, and we kind of start to learn about past conflicts, because going into the movie, you don't know a great deal about any of the characters. And that was something I picked up on this time on my rewatch, was that Logan Marshall Green, who plays Will, who's the protagonist, you only know two things about him going into the film, because the film opens up with Will and his girlfriend driving to the party, and they hit a coyote on the way to the party, and so he has to put it out of its misery with a tire iron. The only thing we know about him, though, is his name, that he's capable of violence, and that he's been divorced. And so just in the opening moments of the film, those are the only things that you know about him. So I felt very much like I was like a fly on the wall in a party full of people that I don't know anything about anybody. And so in a film that's all about kind of opening up old wounds and new tensions arising, and you're trying to kind of just decipher a lot of cryptic communication that happens between characters, I think that is really key in ensuring that we're just as lost as the characters are.
Right. I mean, you know, they go into it. I believe her name is Eden and Dayton. Mm-hmm. They were gone for 2 years, and as the movie kind of unfolds, we learn that it was in some sort of a retreat in Mexico, I believe it was. And so, I mean, again, we're entering this not as, you know, uninformed as obviously their friends are, for however long they've been, you know, homies in that sense, but you know, they don't know who this new Eden is. And, you know, I think Will mentions in the first, you know, whatever, 20 or 30 minutes that she's changed and she's a little bit different. And that starts to plant in like the viewers' heads that like not everything is as it seems, right? I think that's kind of the general direction that the director was taking it to. But again, as everything kind of starts to unfold, to your point, you start to really sense that uneasiness. And I felt like, you know, maybe you can let me know if it was different for you when you were watching it, but was there a point where you were thinking that Will is actually like the bad character of the movie? He's the evil one, so to speak, and everyone else is, you know, kind of the good guys?
Yeah, so I mean, that is kind of like what I was alluding to a little bit, in that you don't really know who he is as a character when the movie starts, and we start to form certain opinions based on the scenarios that we're presented with. But at the end of the day, I think what the movie does such a good job of kind of asking the viewer to call into question whether Will is the protagonist at a certain point in the film. And we'll get into that a little bit more with the reveal at the end of the movie, but it does a fantastic job of really just having the viewer question everything and get to a point where you look at this person that we perceive as being the protagonist just because of we've been stuck with him basically the entire movie. We're staring over his shoulder, as it were. But at the end of the day, like, we could be in the wrong in terms of our interpretation of these events. And I think that really plays out, like you said, in Eden, who is this new version of herself. And we didn't know the older version of herself, but even if she comes off as being very kind of like emotionally aggressive with people in terms of just like very loving and shrugging things off. And we'll get into some of the trauma that the film alludes to between the two characters and why they split. At the end of the day, that puts enough second guessing in our heads to be like, maybe this is just somebody that's found a way to live with something that people shouldn't be able to live with as comfortably, like living with the trauma.
Right. I mean, there's so many different kind of avenues that we can go down. I mean, the director did such a good job, I think, of illuminating how these kind of cults really resonate with folks. Mm-hmm. Again, as we start to learn and the dinner party kind of progresses, we start to understand that these guys, it was Eden and Will, and then it was Pruitt, played by John Carroll Lynch, and a girl named Sadie. Also join in on the dinner party outside of like the normal group of friends in that sense. But you start to kind of get a sense of like there's two different teams almost forming, right? And, I don't know if we want to jump into that film that they kind of played. If we want,
sure.
But yeah, if we jump into that film part, like I think we all have been to a dinner party or hanging out with some friends, at least hopefully pre-COVID in that sense. Where, you guys are hanging out and there's a couple of people that you might not know or two different kind of friend groups mixing together, and someone says something or starts talking about something that's way out nowhere. And you have that face of like Will where you're just, you're not sure if you want to like kind of put your head in your hands or, to kind of walk away or whatnot. So I think the way the storyline kind of started building towards that uneasiness was really good. But to that point too, you never really understood what was going on, I feel like, until about like 45, 50 minutes into the movie where you again start to see that kind of fracturing of the dinner party start to come about.
Yeah, and that was going to be one of my questions to you was, did you think that Kusama did a good job of utilizing kind of just the slow burn? Because that is very much what the movie is, and that's why I think the tension works so well in it in a lot of ways, because it builds gradually, right? Like you said, everybody is, for the most part, is familiar with showing up to a party. You go right to your group of friends. There's generally a few people there you might not know, but when you're meeting people for the first time, people are generally pretty friendly just because that's how people are in group settings the majority of the time. But then as soon as we start to kind of get to know people and some people become more comfortable than they should be, they start to share things that like you wouldn't know about them just from looking at them.
Right.
And so I think in capitalizing and kind of exemplifying that in a way that is very drastic, as we'll get into, I think it is really great in making a familiar situation that we've all been in, but then starting to extrapolate on that in increasingly uncomfortable ways. And when that really ties into the kind of doubt that the viewer has based on what little information we have and who to trust and who is this person or not a reliable narrator or not, I think that really makes a very mundane general premise for a movie that much more engaging.
Right. And I mean, again, we see, there's a moment where Will is outside, or no, I'm sorry, Will is inside and he sees David lighting up like
a lantern.
Yeah, lantern outside, and it's red. And again, there are these little kind of Easter eggs that the director kind of leaves out to us. Choi, excuse me, where is he? What exactly are Pruitt and Sadie doing here? Who is the guy? There was a knock on the door and David and Pruitt walked out, and we didn't know necessarily who they're talking to. I don't think we ever actually, correct me if I'm wrong. Do we actually ever find out who they were talking to in that scene?
I don't believe so. I would bet it was them turning away somebody that was coming. Like maybe it was. Well, I guess you don't know, but I think it was them just trying to persuade someone not to come in because of what they have planned. There's no real margin of error here, even though we see how horribly things unfold at the end of the movie. At the same time, though, they want as few people inside of the house that they haven't like pre-approved basically to be there.
So other people are asking questions in that sense.
Yeah.
To that point, you mentioned, you won't know guests from like those small interactions until people, start getting a little too boozy and they start to tell people stuff that they might not necessarily do when they're sober. When Sadie got up, and I think, I forget the game that they were doing, but what you want, or what you wanted to express, essentially she got up and with like a weird kind of like a Manson kind of a smile, she was like, I love you guys, and I just want to let you know that. And that whole entire 20-second spiel, I just felt my skin crawling, man. It was just so unnerving, because again, you have that notion of there's something off already, right? The alarm bells are going off. You just don't know necessarily how. But when you started doing that, you just see her like nasty teeth. I mean, I don't know.
I think, again, that's a combination of not only the talent involved in the film, but also just the pacing and the way that information is presented. Like the most obvious answer is presented first, where the friends of Will's are joking, oh, Eden and David and these two other people they don't know, oh, they joined a cult and all these things. And they make it into a joke. So it almost dispels your first instinct of these people that are all smiles. Everything is fine in the world. And yet they start to reveal the facade that they're putting on of somewhat normal starts to break away a little bit. And we see that progressively, just like with the game that they play that you mentioned. And I think it really is a combination of those things that it allows it to build in a really nice and smooth way. It's not super overbearing at the top of the movie. It doesn't hit you over the head with the fact that, hey, this is what's definitely going to happen, because I think in dispelling it, and then they present situations that are easily dismissed. And the big moment with that is like with Troy when he shows up, because David has that moment, or Will has that moment where he's like, where is he? And he blows up and he assumes like, I've cracked this thing. I've cracked whatever facade that they're putting on. And then he shows up. And at that point in the movie, I assume you were as well, just like I was, we're just like, oh shit, maybe this person we've pushed all of our chips into is the one that is the odd man out. And he's reading too much into things because of his trauma.
I mean, that's the look on Will there is the look of a guy that like took out like his family life savings and put it into like a multi-level marketing scheme and
into a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, it just I think we've all felt that, you're so confident in something being the way that, you perceive it. And then as that curveball hits, there's nothing you could do but apologize, right? And I think that is what he does. He ends up apologizing to David and kind of goes out on his own for a little bit. Shout out also to Kira. She is the girlfriend that you could have in a movie or not in a movie. Like, that guy freaked out a couple different times and all she was doing was trying to be supportive. I feel like the roles were reversed and my girlfriend was doing that, I'd probably...
Well, Kusama had a great quote in the commentary for the movie where she says that it's very much, the film itself is kind of like a black comedy in a sense of like manners. And she said, what we discovered is how much the movie is about being polite and how dangerous that can be. And how the group of friends keep discounting all of these oddities amongst Eden and her new friends and her new husband because they're being polite. You're doing something, you're offering up a certain set of a demeanor, essentially, that we're taught from a young age, if we had half decent parents, you're taught you're in somebody else's home. You need to respect their home. You need to respect them. You need to respect their friends and family and whatnot, not take advantage of their hospitality. And so in being overly polite, we find it again, it's almost to a satirical degree where people start to, like, one of the big things when I've talk to some people about this movie is they're like, oh, well, at a couple points they should have just left. And it's like, well, for starters, there's no movie if somebody just decides to leave the house. You know what I mean? Like they're in the house and so we can play this story out. But this idea that people can't help themselves in being polite. And there's even like that example you said about Sadie, where Sadie, she makes out with one of Will's friends, and one of the friends excuses it by saying she's just she's painfully sexually awkward or something like that. And it's like, that's a pretty bold move to make on somebody that you don't know, that you just met. And so in terms of just like applying that politeness to a situation where you should not be polite at all, and we see that Will is the only one that kind of breaks this polite streak that everybody else is essentially incapable of.
Right.
Especially when one of his friends tries to leave and David like takes her arm and tries to keep her there. And Will is just like, that's one of the moments where he snaps and he's just like, let her go. You're going to do this. And I think that he is supposed to be the viewer in a lot of ways, in that, hey, if that was happening and I saw that happening, I would be the one to not give a fuck about being polite. But a majority of people might not, because of the sort of preconceived notions we have about being polite.
Right. Well, I mean, again, and the thing is, I can't give enough credit to Miss Kusama, the director. The cookie crumbs that she gives us, for instance, like those flashbacks where Eden, I think she was like cutting her wrist in the
yeah, it was a suicide attempt.
And then that it's kind of juxtaposed. 5 or 10 minutes later, you see them having a flashback. Kind of being romantic in like a bathtub, and their kid at that point, walks in, and they have like a little jovial conversation between Eden and Will. That balance between it being kind of heartache and despair, and then that love, I think it's played out in the movie, right? Especially when you see there's a moment where Will is walking by, I believe it was the bathroom, and he sees Sadie in there, and she's like yelling into the mirror or doing weird faces, and then she does that again. She does that like Manson smile at the end, and you're like, what the fuck is going on, right? Like,
right.
There's something off. And
in using Sadie's character as an example, those are some of the scenes where I was unsure if we could kind of be reliant on Will as a narrator, because the first time he meets Sadie, she's standing in the doorway at the end of the hall and she's naked. And it's just like, what the fuck? Like, why would somebody be in the house doing that? And the first time I watched it, I was like, did he just imagine that?
Right, as a hallucination of something.
Yeah, is that like a hallucination? Like, why would that happen there? And she's very reserved in the way that she includes those kinds of weird, inexplainable moments that really challenge the viewer to think about all the information that they've been given. And especially like the flashbacks, did you think that those were handled well? Because I think early on they're sparingly used, but it's at pretty key moments in the film.
I think it's kind of like putting together a puzzle, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense when we're watching it, but at the end of the movie, when we kind of see the whole picture, then it's illuminated a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, again, to your point, I had no idea what the hell was going on for the first hour of the movie, basically. First time I watched it, and even the second time I was watching it, like I have a good general idea of what's going to happen, obviously, but still there were those unnerving moments where, again, you're just catching yourself. Is Will the protagonist or is he the antagonist, right? And is this just a weird hallucination and Eden and David are completely normal, or am I crazy? Right. So again, the way that the movie is framed, and they have those different small scenes that, for instance, David locking the door, it obviously naturally gives you this kind of a claustrophobic feeling, but then he puts the key back in the door, and I don't think he unlocks it even, but still it just gives us like I guess in a human sense, it relaxes us a little bit. But to your point, right, there were so many different things that you can just throw away on their own, where you start adding them up. You're like, yeah, something isn't making fucking sense here, and we got to figure that out.
Yeah, you start almost keeping track like on a tally board of just like, oh, here's something suspicious. Oh, we've resolved that. Here's something suspicious. We've resolved that. And it goes back and forth. And again, I think really even on a rewatch, like I hadn't seen this in a year probably. And obviously I know the direction it goes in, but I really was appreciative of the fact that they craft real doubt in Will's character. And especially in thinking and in talking to you about it, like when he finds the pills, they used to share that house together. For all we know, Will is the one that is so rippled by the trauma, and we find out from losing their child and dealing with Eden, who was suicidal at one point. I think it put real doubt in my mind, like those could be his pills left over from, it's only been 2 years. She didn't move out. Maybe some of the belongings got left behind, like that kind of thing. And I think that in doing that, it again elevates this very just a simplistic premise of a dinner party. And some people are acting strange, but there's enough doubt there that none of the, well, I'll just, from this point on, we'll refer to them as cultists. The cultists, they don't do anything that's overtly alarming in the sense that it's like a fight or flight moment. You know what I mean? Like you said, there's those moments where he takes the key out of the door and locks it. And it's like, that's weird, but that's something you can explain away. But then they resolve it instantly by him saying, okay, well, relax, I'll put the key in there. And we get enough of those little moments that you really do question whether Will is the one that he is almost jealous of the fact that these people have learned and found a way to disperse of their grief and trauma.
Right. I mean, there's, we mentioned it earlier, that video that they watch, which is essentially it opens up to, I think people were like, kind of like walking through a field or something like that, doing meditation and yoga. And then this like 2-minute and 30-second video ends with like a woman dying surrounded by people that love her. And
yeah.
The guy going, she's found peace. And they're like, the cultists, right? They're like, so what do you guys think? And it's
right.
I think every reaction of the non-cultists, Will, Kira, Tommy, like those guys, right? Everyone's just looking around. I think just like the audience is going, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, what the hell is happening? And then a moment a little later where Pruitt, played by, again, John Carroll Lynch, who's phenomenal in this. That speech that he gives, again, where it's like he has a wife and you understand that something obviously happened to her, but then as he explains it, you learn that he is, all intents and purposes, he killed her, right? Whether or not. And he's like, I've found peace and I can go on with it. Again, Will is looking around like, is this really happening?
Yeah.
I think I had that same reaction most of the audience does, right? So until we get up to that, what is it, that second floor where they have like the actor party there, don't think that really, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't think anyone really has an idea of what the hell is going on until we get to the point where people are chewing in slow motion. It seems like either Will is having a panic attack or you are as the viewer.
Right. We're very much in his anxiety at that point.
Right. Like, that slow motion capturing of like people pouring wine as like the camera kind of goes over the table. Those shots, like the cinematography in this was really, really well done. It kind of keels in on people eating food and like breaking the chicken or whatever they're eating right in their mouth. And it's kind of juxtaposed with Will sweating and kind of shaking weirdly. And again, that's where in my head, when I first watched this, I was almost 100% sure at that point that like Will is a murderer or something and he's going to kill everyone and something, right? Like I don't know much about this director outside of, I think she directed a movie with Jennifer Fox, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, she did Jennifer's Body.
Jennifer's Body, there we go.
And she did a movie, I believe, last year called Destroyer with Nicole Kidman.
There we go. So, I mean, I've seen Jennifer's Body, but that wasn't anywhere near the level of this was, for a variety of reasons. But again, going to that point and then seeing Choi is back, he didn't die, right? He wasn't, kidnapped or some kind of weird thing that could have happened to him. It was a case of just something at the last minute happened, and then Will is, he's kind of freaking out in the background now while everyone else is kind of opposed to him. Actually, real quick, did you notice that in that scene, everybody looks like they're against Will in the shot, right? It's close up on Will's face, and then everyone, like, it goes back to the dinner party and they're all kind of away at him looking at him. Again, I think huge credit to the cinematographer and the director for putting that together. But again, it gives you in that notion that it's definitely Will now. He's lost his mind, and then the craziness starts happening from the cultists. I mean, it's a curveball of all curveballs, I feel like, in movies.
Yeah, and I mean, those are all great examples of just how they're able to weaponize the viewer's lack of understanding. In that we see him become more and more duressed as everyone else around him becomes more and more comfortable. And it does help, of course, everybody else has been boozing all night and whatnot. But at the same time, it really does make him at odds, and it makes him very much isolated from the rest of the group. And we see that periodically throughout the film. There are multiple moments where he moves off into the kitchen, he goes into a different room, he goes outside to use his phone, whatever. And he very much is becoming isolated from everybody else in the house. And his friends, who, granted, he hasn't seen them in 2 years because of the tragedy that occurred, they become almost more friendly with the cultists at a certain point because everybody is so confused by his behavior. And just in that isolation, it really does speak to this idea that maybe we should be warming up to the cultists more than we're warming up to Will. Because apparently, how can all of these other people be so wrong about this new group of people that they don't really know? But to go back to the scene that you talked about with John Carroll Lynch, that is the most chilling part of this movie. And it is a perfect example, I think, of how Kusama kind of scales everything. And the way that he's giving this speech, and up until this point, the whole cult angle has very much been love and peace and being surrounded by loved ones. And yeah, that video was really weird and unsettling. But at the end of the day, there's nothing overtly, I guess, there's obviously nothing overtly violent about it, or there's no overtly sinister nature to it. You know what I mean? It's not like them snuffing the person out or putting a pillow over their face or something. It's kind of these people that have this way of thinking that is very foreign to everybody. But at the same time, on some level, what they're saying is not so alarming that you can understand the thought, even if you don't agree with it. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I wouldn't want to watch that. But when they start explaining it and they explain it so calmly, you're like, okay, I understand why they think that, even if I don't agree with it, or even if it's still disturbing.
No, absolutely.
But in that speech that John Carroll Lynch gives about killing his wife, the way that he begins that, you assume that he's just going to tell us what happened. He did this horrible thing, and this is how he was able to get rid of his grief and his trauma and acceptance with it. But then he takes it one step further, and it shows how the film kind of sneaks up on you and escalating the weirdness in that he talks about hitting her, she hit her head, but then he gives these little details that are so disturbing that don't add anything to what his admission of guilt. It's almost like he's reveling in the memory when he talks about how he hit her, she hit her head, and then she started clawing to get up off the floor, and he starts like imitating it, and you're just like, okay, this is taking it one step further. Like, oh, he's actually like reveling in a fond memory or something like that. Like it's like anytime you've been at a party and somebody is adding detail to a story that is way too much information, and usually that story and information isn't about beating your spouse to death.
Generally speaking, at the dinner.
I mean, hopefully,
I mean, again, the way that the director juxtaposes it, right? You have these cultists who are, in theory, accepting of their faults, whatever they may be, as little or horribly aggressive as they are, right? And then you have Will, who is, in theory, a normal person. I mean, obviously, as we learn, his son dies, right? I don't know necessarily how. Did he get hit by a ball or something? What was it?
So they had a birthday party at the house, and the kids were playing baseball or something, and another boy swung the bat, and I assume he hit him in the head or in the back of the head or something and killed him. Which, yeah, it's a pretty traumatic way to lose somebody.
Right, and I mean that little guy was, I don't think they ever mentioned an age, but he seemed really young. I think he was like under 10 or something like that. So I mean, obviously anyone that goes through that, they're going to be in some sort of a grief cycle, right? But then I don't think it was right after Pruitt had made his speech. I forget at what point it was, like in that kind of first act when they're downstairs. But Will freaks out and he goes to Eden. He's like, "Our son died. His death meeting," and
yeah,
you juxtapose his emotional, his voice is peaked, right? Like you can see the energy versus Pruitt, who's like, yeah, I killed my wife, and trying to grab at me or whatever, trying to have my help up, and then collapsed and she's dead. And he said motionless with nothing in his body whatsoever. So I think that kind of differentiation of the anti-cultists versus the cultists brings home the point of, those guys were completely remorseless, and that's, I think, how that snowball of situations ended up happening for the guests there.
Yeah, and I mean, if you weren't listening, if there was no audio in those two scenes and you're juxtaposing them, there's no audio, you've never watched the movie before, you would assume that Pruitt is, by all intents and purposes, normal. While it's a creepy way, the shot is creepy because of what he's saying and the way it slowly zooms in on him. But at the same time, his body language, like you said, is very reserved. He's very just mellow. Whereas if we watched Will having that outburst, which is very much justified, and what he's saying is true, this idea that his ex-wife disappears in the woods, comes back with these dudes, and all of a sudden she's able to forget the trauma of losing their son, or she seems to have. But then Will, just based on his body language, and I mean, based on the fact that he's got this outrageous facial hair and long hair and everything, you would assume that he was crazy, and you would assume that he's the antagonist. So I think you raise a good point that I hadn't thought about, in that just juxtaposing the demeanor of the cultists and then obviously of the guests, and especially Will, it is very unsettling, and it kind of just adds more underlying fear and tension to the entire film.
Right. I mean, to that point, right, there was in that scene when they're basically, what's her face, Sadie kisses Gina, and then David asks Gina, okay, so what do you want? She's like, I'd like to do some coke that we used to do in college. And my man David's on the ready, apparently. He has some, and he's like, she kind of, I almost said the Russian word. She kind of is, my brain isn't working. She basically gets a little bit anxious or, red in the face, kind of blushing about, maybe I don't actually want to do it, right? And David's like, no, you said it, you want to do it. So the way of thinking is like, it's a little bit more freer and expressive. And there's also a point where Sadie, Lindsay Burge is a great actress, the actress that plays Sadie, but I can't say enough how much I fucking hated that character.
Yeah.
How creepy she was.
Yeah.
Will is outside by the pool, just, one of the 15 times that he ended up outside away from the party.
He did spend a third of the movie outside.
Really did. I mean, listen, don't get me wrong. I'm usually like that sometimes at parties too. You got to get a little away. But anyways,
and you don't have a dead son.
I do. He knows that. But no. So with Sadie, she comes into him, and they have like a very cordial conversation. Like, oh, do you want me to sit down with you? There's no phone service. And then just out of nowhere, she's like, do you want to fuck me? And it's like, yeah. All right, come on. Like, can we have a little bit of a bridge to that kind of conversation?
Right.
It notches up, right? So she starts saying, obviously, a lot of very sexual things, and she tries to seduce him. And you're thinking, well, again, to that point of these guys, if they want something, they go out and get it. When Gina said she wanted coke, she, in theory, wanted to do it, but she was kind of anxious about how other people would seem. Where it seems like this getaway that the cultists were at, they could do whatever they want. Whether it was, I mean, it's a literal cult, right? Everyone has sex with each other. It's the whole 9 yards. So the way that those two different parties lived and having those worlds merge, again, the way that it happens at the end, where the fireworks go off, so to speak, there's you can't live like that between those,
right?
But it was just very eerie how, like, the differences of personalities and their desires started showing about throughout the film, and it gives like a stark contrast between, again, the cultists and the anti-cultists.
Yeah, and I think again it goes back to this idea that there's nothing so overt that a red flag is sent off to the degree that like there's no other way that this movie can end. And I think that creating enough of that doubt and we get enough of those contrasts where this is strange behavior, but on some human level you understand it. You know what I mean? It's not like they bring a goat out at one point and they're like, we're gonna slaughter this in the living room before we do the. You know what I mean? Like the way that they are able to draw in people is with things that are very socially acceptable. We're going to play a game. We're going to show you a video. They don't oversell this idea of the cult. It very much is presented as a spiritual thing, which I think is much more grounded. Like when you think of cults, you think of insane devil worshiping and all of these things, which a lot of horror movies kind of delve into. And in having a cult give a presentation essentially, or have a recruiting session during the invitation to dinner, which we learn it's a very different type of invitation. I think it creates again enough doubt in the viewer's mind that payoff for the big reveal, which on some extent we all assume at a certain point. Like, you know what I mean? It's a movie about people that are very clearly in a cult. It's going to go one of two ways. Will's going to be crazy, or it's going to be them trying to kill everybody. Even when you get that big reveal that on some level you're anticipating, I think it is that much more shocking and that much more effective because the film has been presented so grounded in a way that, I don't know, there's something about the violence at the end of the movie that is far more sickening to me in a way than I would normally think of, like for a slasher movie or something like that. It's just very domestic, if that makes sense. Like, and the energy level is so calm, especially when Pruitt goes to get the gun and then he starts shooting people and one person gets stabbed later on. There's just a very mellowness to the violence that it's introduced that, I don't know, man, it hits in a way that not a lot of horror movies violence hits.
Well, real quick, so before we jump into that, because there's so much to talk about that scene, but when was that moment where you were like, oh, shit's about to hit the fan? Were you on the same page with Will that there was some sort of I forget the drug that Will had said that he had.
It was like a barbiturate or something.
Yeah, something like that. But essentially, from my understanding, they used that and they put that into the wine, and then everyone was drinking that, and they were going to die, right?
I'm not sure. I interpreted the medication as this is why Eden is so chill.
Oh, okay.
Because everybody else, the other three cultists are putting on a facade, right? They're orchestrating this. Eden is the one, and I think her reaction at the end of the movie speaks to this, is that she is very much under other people's influence to a certain degree. And then the thing that pushes her over the line and going along with things is that she's all doped up. Because she's the one that no matter what's going on, she's all smiles and she's able to brush past things and whatnot. And she very much, her character carries herself like somebody that doesn't have any rough edges. You know what I mean? Like there's the one moment where she freaks out and slaps one of their friends. But other than that, everything just kind of bounces off of her.
Right. I mean,
you know what I mean?
To that point, Tammy Blanchard, a great performance in this as well.
This movie has so stacked with performances.
It really, I mean, honestly, outside of Logan Marshall, I forget the
Green.
Probably could remember that. Him and Michael Huisman, who played in Game of Thrones, and then John Carroll Lynch has had a couple really good movies. I don't think I've seen too many of these guys and other stuff, but everyone gives a really, really good performance. And getting into that, right? So we're in the scene where Will is looking at the wine basically, and everyone's cheersing. And then I believe it was Gina that drank it first. And kind of clink, and I don't think anyone else does it. And he starts lapping the wine away from people. I don't know if this is just my own craziness, or I don't know if you noticed this, but the way that Will hits Sadie is very I don't know if reminiscent is the right word, but like it seems very similar to how Pruitt described what he did to his wife. And that he like slaps.
Oh yeah.
He hits the like side of a table.
Right.
And she's basically knocked out, and they think she's dead. Again, in my head, I first time I watched this, I genuinely thought, okay, Will is definitely the bad guy now. He's completely lost it. And when Kira says she's not breathing and it turns back over to Gina and she's like frothing at the mouth or foaming at the mouth, excuse me. What was your thought on that? Because everything starts to go into slow motion and there's so many different things happening. I'd love to hear your kind of take on what was going on in your head.
Well, for starters, that's a great point. I never thought about that or paid attention to the fact that that's how the way that Will kills her essentially is the same way that Pruitt killed his wife. It's just one was intentional and one was not really. Seeing Gina frothing from the mouth it's kind of morbid, but it was relief because, oh, thank God, Will is not crazy. I haven't put all my eggs in this person's basket and then they end up being the crazy person. But again, it's kind of the subtlety of which the violence occurs in that scene and just more about the mellow energy in terms of the cultists. Whereas all of the guests are horrified and they're saying, oh shit, she must be having some sort of reaction to something. They're not even on the same wavelength as Will, where Will watches the video and he sees the doctor that's the head of the cult basically like telling it's a suicide mission, basically telling everybody it's time, you're going to be with me, which in their fucked up view of life, like the only way to do that is for everybody to die. But then you see like Pruitt walking to the bedroom to go get a gun, or I believe it was David actually. David goes to fetch the gun, but he doesn't even say anything and nobody addresses him because they're so fixated on Gina, understandably so. But just the cold, calm, and cool, calculated manner with which he goes to get the gun to finish people off, like it's just super disturbing to me again because it's very domestic. It feels very much like something that could happen in a way that's not fantastical, that's not done in service of just like getting to a certain point in the narrative. Like it feels very grounded and very, very real.
I agree 100%. I mean, there's two different basically deaths, so to speak, that we're dealing with, right? In theory, you have Sadie, who's on the ground at that time, bleeding from her head. And we think she potentially is dead in that sense. And then you also have Gina, who's, foaming at the mouth. And then when you have David come in and he shoots, what was that gentleman's name? It wasn't Tommy, it was his boyfriend, Miguel. He shoots
Miguel.
And there's a close-up of Kira, who's basically right next to him when that happens. And she's covered in blood a little bit, and she's like trying to move backwards. And there's just this stone cold, like horror face, like her mouth is open. She's, freaking out, obviously. But that tension and like the music or whatever is going on in the background, that's so eerie. You don't need like a huge explosion or anything like that to capture that kind of horror. It's so simplistic. That effect, I mean, they do just such a great job of making those deaths simplified. But to your point, I mean, the horror magnitude is as big as it can probably be in that kind of a situation.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier before we were recording about like how blown away we were. This movie's budget was $1 million. And for them to convey this level of horror and this level of disgust in very simplistic means in terms of the violence and how those fight scenes play out, I think it just speaks to all the legwork they do for 3/4 of the movie to get that payoff, because a majority of movies don't have that kind of payoff. You become desensitized by the end of the movie, whereas in this, it's just been ramping and building and building and building till once we get something that is, by all means and purposes, it's like very simplistic and it's very what you're expecting. But at the same time, it's been missing from the entire movie that I feel like it just carries an added weight to it. But were there any other major scenes that kind of stood out to you?
So the one other one that really struck with me, and I'm fascinated by cults. I don't know if you've had a chance to see Wild Wild Country yet.
I have not. No. Do I need to add that to my list?
Highly recommend. Yeah, it's like a 8 or 10 part documentary on Netflix, but it's about a cult in Oregon. Anyways, not necessarily pertinent to this discussion, but when Eden shoots herself after she shoots Will, immediately she apologizes, right?
Yeah.
You can tell, and I don't know, to me it really fucked me up, but you could tell how messed up she was after that, because that whole like there's a scene where she's up against or she's sitting against the refrigerator and she's crying and she tells David this isn't how it's supposed to go. In her
Mhm.
mind, she thought she was helping her friends, right? She was
Right.
killing them and murdering all of them, right? And
Yeah.
I think it really hits home when she shoots David, or excuse me, she shoots Will, her ex-husband, and he goes down and Kira's just standing there. And she shoots herself. They carried her to the backyard, and
Yeah.
she's telling him, I just wanted to find peace.
Mhm.
Man, that hit home so much, just in the sense of like everyone's been through some shit before, right? But like
Yeah.
I feel like the central tenet of why cults happen, aside from, again, we talked about like the sex and the power structure and all that stuff, it's people that are broken in some sense and they're looking
Yeah.
for a way to fix it. And
It's manipulating vulnerable people.
exactly. And there's no better example of that than Eden, because she just wanted to find a way to cope with her son dying. And
Mhm.
that's, I think, the last thing she said. I mean, I don't remember
Yeah.
the scene, but she's like, I just want to be with him again. And she dies. And then I feel like Will, Kira, and Tommy, I believe, Tommy, Miguel's boyfriend, they're
Mhm.
now they're all what's left of that group. And
Yeah.
in a weird, sick way, I feel like they value their lives more. And so, in the way of what that cult was trying to do in terms of having people be at peace, obviously they're not necessarily at peace, but they have a newfound understanding of life. I feel like after that, that was my kind of weird way of kind of looking at that ending.
No, I think you're right. And again, you've been talking about like contrasting characters and contrasting different personalities between the characters and their actions and whatnot. And really, I mean, Will and Eden are contrasted in how they're dealing with this grief and how on the outside, Will clearly, like, his friends did not do a great job of taking care of him, because if your friend showed up looking like that, if you showed up, if I hadn't seen you in 2 years and you showed up with this wild long hair and wild facial hair after a tragedy, I would be like, I'd pull you aside and be like, dude, we need to have a talk, like a serious sit down. Like, this is not a fashion statement. This is like a trauma statement. Uh, but, and then you see like his exterior, he's clearly struggling. Whereas contrasted with her exterior presentation, she looks at peace. She's wearing white. All these things we find out. Obviously, it's mostly the drugs that are making her seem so mellow. But to your point, at the end of the day, once they kind of have to get rid of these facades they're putting on for people around them, because Will's always saying that I'm fine, everything's fine. Clearly, we learn in the first 10 minutes of meeting him that things are not fine. But in having that kind of like heart to heart that you mentioned, it really does show that they're on common ground, and it contrasts the very jarring paths that people can go down to kind of deal with their own trauma and dealing with their grief that for the most part seems very unresolved.
The very end, that Eden's dead. Will and Kira are looking out onto I believe it's LA, if I'm not mistaken as well.
Yeah, they're in LA.
When you look out and kind of coming back to that point, we didn't know what what David was lighting that lantern for.
Yeah.
And you see that entire ridge filled with those lanterns, and in the distance you hear like shooting and screaming and fire trucks and all that stuff, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, so this is a wide scale. This isn't just a small thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. Again, to me, I didn't know if they were going to make like the Invitation 2 after that. I feel like that open.
I don't know. There's no more cultists.
Well, that's a fair point. Yeah, hopefully that main guy didn't die.
Yeah.
Again, it kind of gives you a sense of dread of like, okay, these guys survived it, but this is one of thousands of situations that just happened, and trying to think of those stories as well. It just, again, it the director consistently, when you think that everything is somewhat okay, there's always something in the background, or in the basically not in the top of mind for you, where
Right.
oh, shit can hit the fan again in some other way. And again, it just phenomenal ending to that kind of a movie, in my opinion.
This is one of my favorite endings, I think, of any movie I've seen in the last few years, just because it does it does a thing that not a lot of horror movies do, where you have the big reveal, you have the climax, and you think, oh, everything is handled, everything is done. But then they kind of have this secondary oh fuck moment, and they barely give you enough time to process it before the credits hit. And I think in that timing is really important, because then if you're not given much time to process what's happening, it makes it that much more shocking. Even on a rewatch, I find it's super shocking. And it's interesting, the two writers that wrote this, they conceptualized the film around this idea. So this was the first idea they had, and they had said in the commentary, we love movies where the final shot or series of shots tells you something that you couldn't have known before, or that changes everything. And while that's true overall, there is one little line that is a lot more sinister that David says early on when they're kind of introducing the sales pitch, as it were, for the cult early on. He says, oh yeah, it's in these people like us are in LA, they're in New York, it's thousands of people. And so originally I didn't even process that line the first time I watched it. And in hearing it a second time, at first I'm like, that's kind of a throwaway. But then once I saw the ending and that final shot and this oh fuck realization that what just happened in this house is happening all over LA, and based off of that line, we know it's happening all over the country potentially. And it just adds this idea and this reinforcement that the world is a dangerous and scary place. There's nothing about this scenario that, for the most part, is unrealistic. Granted, I don't know how successful all these people would be at killing all these people, but the core concept of that, I mean, we see it in media, and based on all these crime documentaries, people are very easily manipulated to the point where they can do things that if you knew them growing up, you wouldn't be able to guess they'd do later in life. And so this idea that you could indoctrinate enough traumatized people, disenfranchised people and whatnot into doing something, I feel like this movie presents that in a very realistic and mellow way that makes it that much more terrifying.
100%. We did a movie, and I'm terribly sorry that I forget. Little Jack's House. What was it?
The house that Jack built.
The house that Jack built. In that movie, we see him, pretending to be, I think it was an insurance salesman, and then he switched to a cop. And this woman, everybody else would have been like, get the hell out of here. She wants to get some extra money, and so she lets him in. That simplistic kind of ideal of people have a problem, I can try and find a way to help you. On a mass scale, like cults, is unfortunately something that does tend to happen in some cases, right? But again, to what you had just said, this is not the scariest movies to me. Aren't necessarily zombie movies or things that are just, it's not necessarily realistic. It's the kind of movies where the premise is very simple, and as things unfold, you definitely can see some characteristics of people that you probably know in your life, whether it's family members or people that you're friends with, that have some of those small characteristics that folks that are both on the cult side and that are on, the normal people side in that sense. And you're like, yeah, I can see somebody getting into this kind of a thing if something goes wrong in their life, or if, the right kind of conversation comes about. So that eeriness is definitely there.
I mean, to piggyback off that too, it doesn't even have you look at other people differently. To some extent, it had me look differently at myself. It had me ask the vital question in movies like this that are so based on people and how events affect people. How would I react if I suffered a tragedy like that? And of course, the first gut wrench or reaction would be, well, I would never join a cult. I'm not stupid. I could clearly see through that. But then you have to realize, once you kind of get past that knee-jerk assumption that you would make, is you don't know how you would react when you're rippled by trauma. And clearly, some people get help. We see two people who did not get the proper help that they needed. And we see the two, again, contrasting their experiences with grappling with that guilt and grief and whatnot. And I mean, any movie that you can watch and then have you look at yourself and others differently, I think that really says something. And that makes this movie effective in a way that not a lot of horror movies are, especially ones that are more supernatural, because you can easily explain away those situations for the most part, even if they are terrifying. At the end of the day, once you leave the theater, for the most part, you're like, okay, that was a good movie.
Right.
But in this, again, just the overall presentation and the way that it really makes you look internally at yourself in a lot of ways, I just think is really, really well done.
I mean, to that last point, I'll leave you with this, man. But I think the fact that you were looking at yourself more so at the end of this movie, you're going to be declining any dinner party invitations you give out in the future.
Oh, dude, as soon as we all get vaxxed up, we're having a post-COVID party. So I hope you're ready.
I'll be MIA for that one after this. But I appreciate you having me on this, man. Thank you so much, buddy.
Yeah, of course. I was happy to chat about The Invitation, which is currently streaming on Netflix. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram and @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.